First of the value scale exercises is actually drawing out our own value scale. You're going to need 10 sequential equally sized squares drawn out on your paper. To do this, you're going to need a pencil and a ruler. We're going to lay out these 10 1-inch squares in a single row. Here's how you do it. First, we're going to draw a 10-inch line using our ruler across the surface of the paper. Keep your eraser handy. You may need to make some corrections, and I would advise you to draw lightly to make sure if you make any mistakes, they're not impossibly burnished into your paper's surface. Then, you're going to draw a 1-inch line downward from the end of that 10-inch line. You'll do this on both ends of that 10-inch line. When you've completed this vertical line drawing task, you will then connect the open ends of those lines to create a 10-inch by 1-inch rectangle. Our next task is to divide this long rectangle into a series of 1-inch squares. To do that, place your ruler on the bottom line. Everywhere an inch tick mark is hit, make a dash using your pencil, holding the ruler securely against the surface of the paper. Do this for the entire length of the long skinny rectangle. You're now going to repeat this process on the top line. Everywhere you see an inch mark, make a dash. We're going to connect both the top and the bottom dashes to create our separations for our 1-inch squares. Now we're going to connect the dashes. Line up your ruler and press it down firmly onto the surface of your paper, drawing your lines in order to make sure you have a clear separation from each square. This is the point that we make sure our lines are neat and everything is clear and easy to understand. If you have any corrections to make with your eraser, now is the time. We're going to number each individual square. This is important later on because our task is to try to match the values to the original value scale as closely as possible. You want to make sure the easiest one, a 1, matches clearly, but a 10 also matches as well. Honestly, the 1 and the 10 are the easiest ones to get right. You press down real hard on the 10, you don't do anything at all on the 1. The thing that becomes challenging is making sure your 2 through 9 are done accurately. You want to make sure your 4 matches your 4, your 7 matches your 7, and so on. When filling in your values, you want to make them as opaque as possible. That doesn't mean necessarily make them as dark as possible, but you want to minimize the streaky white lines that occur when you space your shading lines too far apart. Make shorter strokes. If your strokes match the entire length of the square, they're probably too long. Make short, controlled strokes with your pencil on the surface of your paper, frequently changing direction. If you're burnishing the paper, feel free to press as hard as you want. Next, I'm going to try to shade in the 5 value on my value scale. It's distinctly more challenging than just a darkened in area, so I'm probably going to have to make multiple passes at it. I applied my graphite to the surface of my paper by slanting my pencil at a sharp angle to cover more surface area with the graphite. Don't get frustrated if you have to make multiple passes to try to match the values. This is totally typical. Sometimes you'll have to remove values with your eraser or even out areas where it's gotten too dark or too light in specific spots. This is a pretty challenging process. That's why you're going to get a lot of time to do it. These value scale exercises are teaching you not just motor skill control, but the ability to observe distinct value applications. Go ahead and fill out the remaining squares and match them to the values of your original scale. Next up, we're going to create a 1-point perspective box and apply values to give it that illusion of depth. I've drawn a long line with a black dot on it, as you can see on the screen. To draw a 1-point perspective box, you may have to break some old habits. Most of my young learners do this. We'll draw a series of 2 overlapping squares and connect the corners to create a 3D look. This is an incorrect perspective, so I'm going to show you how to do it correctly. To do that, there are a few terms I'm going to show you just to commit to memory so I can explain it clearly. The first thing I want to talk about is the vanishing point. That little black dot I indicated on the screen. It lies on top of what we call a horizon line, or a flat surface where the sky and the ground meet. We're going to draw a 2-inch square close to the middle of our paper. Do your best to keep your ruler perpendicular to the edges of your drawing area. Line up your ruler to make sure your lines are clean and crisp. If you have a bit of line overlap, don't worry. Erase it with your pencil later on. Now, for the purpose of this exercise, I've dotted the corners of this square so I can make everything clear. We're going to draw a series of diagonal lines connecting those dots back to the vanishing point on our drawing area. It's important that I mention you draw these diagonal lines very, very lightly. These diagonal lines, or as they're called, orthogonal lines, are designed to give that illusion of depth through line only. Using my ruler, I'm going to lightly draw in those lines, connecting them back to the vanishing point. Much of the line will be erased later, so it's important that you draw lightly. So forgive me for being redundant. That bottom right corner on this example, I'm not going to use my ruler to connect the line back to the vanishing point. That would mean the box is transparent, and this particular box is going to be opaque. Next, we're going to pick that bottom left orthogonal line. We're going to make a dot. You might be asking where to put the dot. Don't worry, just pick an area, that feels comfortable. But I am going to make a perpendicular line connecting that bottom dot to the next line. Where those lines converge, I'm then going to make a horizontal line. This new corner I've made is the three-dimensional look of the block. I can go ahead and erase the remaining orthogonal lines because they're not needed anymore. Next, we're going to draw 3 more lines. 2 of them will be orthogonal lines going downward from the block. We're going to line our ruler back up and draw an extended version of that bottom orthogonal line going down towards the bottom of the paper. Next, we're going to move on to the bottom right corner. Be sure you line up your dots from the vanishing point to the bottom right corner to create this new orthogonal line. After I draw down, I'm going to create a horizontal line connecting those 2 open points on the bottom orthogonal lines. This new 4-sided shape or quadriceps that I've created will be for the shadow of the cube. Next, I'm going to assign some numerical values to the cube so we know what values we're going to actually apply to the cube shape itself. It'll be 8 on the front, 5 on the side, and a 2 on the top, but the shadow will go from 10 to 1, from dark to light. This blending technique should have a smooth application. When shading in the shadow of the cube, feel free to use a shading stump or even your finger to help smooth out those values. This helps push the graphite into the surface of the paper, softening the transitions from dark to light. Next up, I'm going to show you how to shade or render a spherical form, or a ball. Now, if I'm drawing a circle, I would advise against freehanding it. Whenever drawing a round form, it's wisest to use a tool like a compass or protractor, or even a stencil. Sometimes it's easier just to trace the bottom of a cup or bowl. As you can see here, by using a stencil, I was able to get a really round shape. Next, I'm going to determine where my light source is located. I decided to make it towards the top left side of the ball on the paper. Determining your light source is key because it shows you where your lightest and darkest areas on the sphere will be. Now, I'm going to draw 4 overlapping circles. I just freehanded it, but the point is to determine where my values are going to be applied. After these 4 overlapping circles inside my bigger circle have been put in place, I'm going to go ahead and assign numerical values to them. You don't have to write these on your sphere. In fact, you shouldn't. They're here to give you a goal to aspire to when shading in your values. After you've applied your values to your spherical form, feel free to apply pressure from your finger or shading stump to smooth out those transitions. Again, on your version, you shouldn't have numbers written on each circle. They're just guides to help the viewer understand what we're trying to achieve. Feel free to also apply your eraser. If you get too much value in a surface area, it's always wisest to subtract. You can add it back again later. The thing you really don't want to do is use your eraser and rub a hole in your paper. Lastly, we're going to go over our still life exercise. There are a few key things you need to accomplish. First, sketch very lightly on your still life. It's important to sketch lightly because erasing your composition at certain points is actually part of the plan. Use 5 shades of value throughout the image, especially on your rounded objects like your sphere or cylinder. Adjust your scale correctly. Don't run off the edges and don't make your objects too big. Keep the edges of the composition about 1.5 inches away from the edge of the paper. Don't make your image so small that you're wasting a lot of your surface area. I also want to talk very briefly about vertical perspective. On panel number 1, you have an apple and a pear. Which one is closer to you? If you trust your instincts, you probably said an apple. But because the pear is bigger, it might be confusing. But it could also just be a big pear. In panel number 2, you'll see that the pear is actually closer to the apple because it's lower on the page's composition. This vertical arrangement of objects, or in this case fruit, is called vertical perspective. How high or low you place the object determines how close it is to the viewer. As you can see on panel number 3, it's actually pretty easy to tell. The apple is clearly closer to you than the pear. We know this not only because it is placed lower on the drawing area, it's overlapping the pear, obscuring part of its view. However, things get really confusing on panel number 4. If you see that the pear is not only placed higher, but it placed in front of the apple, obscuring parts of the apple. This shows the viewer that not only is the pear closer to us, it possesses magical powers for floating. I haven't seen very many pieces of fruit that can pull this off, but if you can figure it out, you'll probably have a pretty sound career in the science fields. The purpose of this exercise is not to redefine the science fields, however. So, for the purpose of our still life, let's just make most of our objects arranged in a way that makes sense with regular gravity, like you see in panel number 3. For the purpose of this exercise, I've presented an image of geometric forms in the top left corner. Sketching is a really important part of determining your composition of your drawing. You look at these sloppy lines and layout, and you might be thinking to yourself, this is sort of a bad drawing. And the truth of the matter is, you're right. It's not a good drawing. But it does do one thing really effectively. It's a good sketch. A good sketch allows us to figure out how big the objects are, whether or not they fit on the page effectively, and it helps us figure out how far from the borders our composition is going to be. Be sure you don't make your objects too big so that they crop to the edges of the paper. And if you make them too small and waste all of this surface area, you're using too much negative space in your composition. Keep your images about 1.5 inches away from the edge of your paper. After you finish sketching it in, you can go and clean up your composition. Then apply your values to your corrected shapes.